This is a Global Player original podcast.
Nearly 20 years ago, in the summer of 2005, 4 suicide bombers targeted London's transport system, killing 52 and injuring 700. The worst single terror attack we've ever seen on British soil. It changed the face of terrorism in this country forever. Unlike the 9/11 attacks in the US, the 7/7 bombers grew up in Britain. Since that horrific day, more than 800 people have been jailed for terror offences in the UK. Today, this podcast can exclusively reveal that of those, 540 have since been released. And more than half, around 300 of them, refused deradicalisation programmes while in jail, and still hold the same extremist views that got them jailed in the first place. Do the authorities know where these people are? How do the security services monitor them? The majority of these convicted terrorists are homegrown, so why did they turn their backs on Britain? Welcome to The Crime Agents.
The Crime Agents.
Welcome to the podcast. My name's Andy Hughes and I've been a crime journalist for 2 decades. I've gone undercover with gangs and I've infiltrated the far right.
And my name's Neil Basu. I'm a former Metropolitan Police officer. I started as a beat Bobby in Battersea back in 1992 and I finished in 2021 as the National Head of Counter Terrorism Policing, as an Assistant Commissioner sitting on the Metropolitan Police Board and running the counter-terrorism operations in the UK.
Well, your list is a lot longer than mine, isn't it?
Well, you said I could take as long as I wanted.
Well,
I had at least a page of my CV to go.
Well, since you went on so long, I better say a bit more about me then. Well, I've infiltrated the far right, several far right groups. I've also done an undercover investigation into football hooligans. That got a bit hairy at one point. And at one point, the bomb squad was called into my house. So I'll be speaking about that on a later episode. But I think it's fair to say we've looked at similar things, but from very different perspectives.
I think that's the reason journalists and police officers secretly get on.
Oh, I think so.
Because decent investigative journalists are very much like decent detectives, in my view.
Indeed. So, Neil, the reason I wanted to look into this was because we're on the eve of 7/7, of course, and this was such a significant and monumental moment in our history. It changed the face of terrorism forever. It clearly inspired a whole new generation of terrorists who wanted to commit jihad. So what I did was I collated data from the Home Office, the Counter-Terror Policing Network, and the Ministry of Justice. And what we found was that since 7/7, there have been 870 people convicted for terror offences. Now, more than 800 of those, Neil, received a prison sentence for serious offences ranging from murder, preparation of a terror attack, all the way down to the lowest scale of offences, if there is such a thing when it comes to terrorism, to things like possessing terrorist documents. And we can reveal in this podcast that up to 540 convicted terrorists have now been released and are on our streets. And a source of mine in counter-terrorism tells me that more than half of those released, around 300, refused deradicalisation programmes in prison. What comes to your mind when you hear those figures?
Well, a certain level of post-traumatic stress, to be honest. So 7/7's, we're in the 20-year anniversary of 7/7, and you're right, it did set the horrific bar for terrorist offending in this country, based on Salafist, Islamist, jihadist politics inspired by Al-Qaeda. But if we wind forward to 2017, when I was the Senior National Coordinator running operations with MI5, for a calendar year, we arrested more than 485 terrorists. It's never happened before or since.
That's extraordinary.
Over a terrorist a day being arrested, many of them being charged and convicted. I think our conversion rate from charge to conviction was something like 85%.
High.
So what you've just is, we're very good at gathering the evidence, let me tell you, and MI5 are very good at giving us the intelligence. But what I would say is it feels like we were victims of our own success. We thought we were protecting the public and we were putting these people away, but we were having to arrest people earlier and earlier. We didn't want to let them run their preparation for their plot and to allow that plot to unfold and potentially lose lives. So we were having to intervene earlier with what I would describe as lesser offences.
Yeah, so therefore they get released from prison earlier.
Yeah, instead of a life sentence, you're looking at a maximum sentence of, say, 10 years.
Yeah.
And when the judge is sentencing the time they've spent on remand after we've arrested them.
Yeah.
So they won't be bailed, but they will be spending time in prison before they're convicted. That's taken off the sentence. They're only going to, back in those days, they were only doing 50% of their sentence anyway. So you can take off half the sentence. So you're at 5 years maximum, less any time they spent on remand. And then there are other ways of cutting that sentence down, depending on the judge and the offender's profile and the mitigating or aggravating circumstances of the offence. What you end up with is sometimes a couple of years, sometimes even less than that. What do you do with them when they're released? And how do you monitor them when they're inside? And I think it's fair to say that we were alongside the probation service and the prison service, counter-terrorism policing and the intelligence agencies were too complacent about, we thought our job was done when the prison gates shut.
Right, yeah.
And it wasn't.
Oh, God, no.
And it's definitely not, given your investigation and what you've revealed now about the number of people who've come out.
Just to give you all a flavour of the types of characters who are out in the streets now. The man who helped the 7/7 bombers and attended terrorist training camps with them. 2 weeks after the atrocities, another group, 4 men, tried to do the same, but this time they failed. They went on the run and started a massive manhunt. This group were helped by 5 men who not only helped them plan, but they provided safe houses for them, allowed them to evade capture for up to a week. They're all out now. And the man who radicalised the Manchester Arena bomber and sent several young men to Syria to fight for ISIS, they're all out.
The idea that terrorists were being released early and were not being monitored sufficiently in prison and were not subject to monitoring and surveillance when they left to a greater degree, shall we say. It's not that they weren't being monitored, it's just it wasn't perfect, is a lesson that we learnt from 2019. So you remember November 2019 Fishmongers Hall horrific attack. I'm so sorry to the Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones families, who are amazing people. I don't want to bring all of that up again, but I want to say to them, we learnt a lot during that period. In February 2020 in Streatham High Road, a terrorist was shot dead by one of my surveillance teams, having launched an attack literally within minutes of walking down the high street. We had the Reading attack in Forbury Gardens later on in June that year. These were all released terrorists who clearly had not been de-radicalised, had been through a prison system in which, and certainly the Fishmongers Hall guy who was there at a Cambridge University event, had duped some professionals. He had basically convinced professionals he had been de-radicalised, and that is not all of them, but some of them, and that was a very hard lesson.
Yeah, and that man you're talking about right there, Usman Khan, he was jailed in 2012 for being part of an Al-Qaeda cell for plotting to bomb the London Stock Exchange, and also targeting Boris Johnson's home. He was released on licence in 2018. How is that possible, especially when you think months later he went on to kill 2 people at the Fishmongers Hall attack?
I know. I mean, people listening to that will be absolutely horrified. As a counter-terrorism professional, there won't be a single counter-terrorism police officer or intelligence agent working in this field that thinks that is an acceptable sentence for somebody.
No. Well, it's not, is it?
For that crime. And it's difficult without going back to the whole circumstances of the trial and the sentencing and what he was charged with. But it doesn't sound right, does it?
No.
And I always thought part of my job was to reassure people, not just to keep them safe, but to make them feel safe. And it's difficult to feel safe when you're hearing that kind of thing. But we do live in a democracy. There are sentencing guidelines for judges. We don't make the decision. We're not judge and jury. We're there to put the evidence before a court and for the court to decide for the Crown Prosecution Service to decide which offence is going to be charged, and for the court to make a decision on sentencing using guidelines drawn up by a completely independent sentencing council. So police don't have any say in what this sentence is. Now, behind the scenes, we can argue some of these offences, they don't carry a great enough sentence, and we can go to the Sentencing Council and present our case. We have done that in the past, and we've tried to stop what we call unduly lenient sentences. And in fact, Dominic Raab did listen to us in 2017, and he put 19 terrorism offences on the statute books to come under the unduly lenient scheme, which means any member of the public who thinks a sentence is too lenient can effectively complain to the Attorney General and say, you need to review that sentence and have it looked at again. What I was saying earlier about intervening earlier means you are not intervening with the high level offending. We don't want them to commit an attack, so there's no point charging them with murder because they've murdered people. We need to stop that. Preventing the murder is the number one thing. And if we can't prove the intent to commit an attack, all the preparatory work they're doing, well, terrorism allows us to arrest them when they're preparing, but those offences are lower level without that intent, and therefore the sentences are lower.
I've got a few other examples of terrorists who've been released extraordinarily early. Anjem Choudhury, that's probably a name a lot of you recognise. He was a hate preacher from North London. He was linked to the killers of Lee, Rigby and Woolwich in 2013. Now, he was jailed for inviting support to ISIS. Now, I was sat in court, and the prosecution said that he inspired more than 500 people to travel to Syria to join the terror group. In 2016, jailed for 5.5 years. Guess what? Out in 2. I bet you lot were happy about that, were you?
We were not. People who are serving now have to be very diplomatic because they're answering to politicians and the judiciary and people who are going to make independent decisions on whose backing and financing and support they rely. But I can't think of a single counter-terrorism policing professional or intelligence agent that would have been happy with that. That particular terrorist, because that's what he was, at one point we thought he was responsible for radicalising or having some involvement. His movement, the ALM, had some involvement in over 80% of any terrorist attack that had a British footprint. I mean, so you can probably think what we thought of that sentence.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, it's quite often you find counter-terrorism detectives and journalists both walking out, scratching their heads and talking to each other. What the hell was that all that about? Yeah. That's happened many times. Just one more case. Abdel Rauf Abdallah. Now, this man organised a whole group of young men to travel to Syria to join ISIS, including his brother, who became a sniper for ISIS. Now, in 2016, he was sentenced to 9.5 years. He was out after serving half his sentence, recalled pretty quickly after breaching his licence. But he was later found out to be an important factor in the radicalisation of the Manchester Arena bomber Salman Abedi. And it's not all Islamic extremists. I must say that neo-Nazi Harry Vaughan, he pleaded guilty recently to 14 terror offences, including encouraging terrorism and possessing several terrorist documents. Do you know what? He didn't even go to jail. He was given a 2-year sentence, suspended for 2 years.
You're probably looking at my stunned expression, which doesn't make for good. It doesn't make for good radio, does it? But yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised because I know these cases and I know what happened. But yeah, it's stunning, and if it's stunning to the ex-head of counter-terrorism policing, I'm feeling slightly sorry for our listeners and how they must be feeling at this moment in time.
I think one of the most important parts of our investigation is this line about all these convicted terrorists refusing de-radicalisation programmes. Now, just to explain, this is a voluntary course offered to them. They don't have to do it, but if they do, they are showing that they're willing to be rehabilitated. It happens for every type of prisoner, and lots of them take this up, mainly because quite a lot of people want to be rehabilitated. But that's not the case for terrorists. Now, why is that? And also, what are the concerns around prisons when it comes to them radicalising each other? Do you think they're showing off by not taking part in these de-radicalisation programmes? Why are they doing it?
There's a lot in that, Andy. I'm not a behavioural psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I've always had a very clear view that terrorism for me is like an addiction. So I've got a lot of experience of dealing with crime in the addiction space, whether it's alcohol or drug related. You do not cure yourself from alcoholism or drug addiction unless you want to be cured of it. You know, people who deal as addiction counsellors will tell you that until you want to give up, you're not going to give up. And I've always thought, well, terrorism's exactly the same. So the idea that I could persuade you to give up, I was always sceptical of that idea. I always thought that was rather fanciful. I thought, and I was a huge supporter, very vocal public supporter of Prevent. And the reason I was such a supporter of the Prevent scheme, which is one of the pillars of the government's contest strategy, which I wish they'd been more supportive of themselves, is that is a genuine voluntary pre-criminal scheme. So you haven't committed any offence yet. Yeah. You want to speak to somebody because you know you're feeling that you are going down the wrong path and you want to do something about it. And by the way, 7,000 people have been through Prevent. I can't remember the time frame, but I was speaking to the ex-director of Prevent in the Home Office. 7,000 people have been through Prevent. And if only 1% of them were thinking of committing a terrorist attack, that would have foiled 70 plots.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, I foiled 29 in my 6 years in counter-terrorism. Prevent did that. So when they came up with desistance and de-radicalisation, originally that was going to be mandated because you'd committed a criminal offence, you were in prison, you were a terrorist, you were going to have to do this. Did I think forcing somebody to do desistance and deradicalisation was going to work? No, because it's an addiction. Unless they want to change, they won't change. And we have had terrorists who've changed their mind about terrorism and have gone on to cooperate with us. I would say it's rare.
How does it feel when one slips through the net?
I can't possibly tell you what that feels like. So I'm not ashamed. I've said this publicly before. I'm not ashamed to say I had a year of counselling when I left the police. It was incredibly difficult to live with the thought that you had not done enough, that you were not in the right place at the right time. Every attack is seen as an intelligence failure. We all feel it, from the most junior member of counter-terrorism policing on the intelligence agencies to the head of the agencies. We all feel exactly the same. We feel devastated. J. Edgar Hoover once, I was a trained murder squad investigator. You do not want to be a murder squad investigator when you're in counter-terrorism. And J. Edgar Hoover once said there is no greater privilege than to investigate the death of another human being. Having been 6 years in counter-terrorism with 42 people dead on my watch and thousands of people injured, I will say J. Edgar Hoover was wrong. There's no greater privilege than to prevent the death of another human being. And when you can't, and when you haven't, and you have to meet the victims and the bereaved families of the victims and the people who've been injured, I don't think I can adequately explain how it makes you feel.
I'm just curious to know, put myself in your shoes. You're heading up counter-terrorism policing. People are dying. You're preventing a lot of attacks. But when you go home at night, are you constantly on edge? Can you switch off at all? Are you completely anxious? Are you thinking about, as we're talking about in this podcast, there are several of people out there who are looking and planning a terror attack?
People who can switch off are miraculous. You know, if you can compartmentalise your job, you know, and you can leave it at work and you can go home and spend time with your family and friends and loved ones and do your hobbies and enjoy yourself, that's fantastic. You know, if you have that kind of commitment to family, friends, your fitness and your faith, if you have one, then that's great. That was never me. So in the 6 years, 4 months I was in counter-terrorism, I did the 3 most senior jobs in counter-terrorism back to back through the highest threat level this country's seen since the height of the IRA troubles. And 24/7 I was on edge. So I never slept through the night once. I didn't sleep through the night till 6 months after I retired. I was hypertensive. I can tell you that all of my medical signs returned to normal a year after my retirement without me going anywhere near a gym, as is fairly obvious looking at me. So just from the lack of stress of being permanently on edge, on call. I used to joke with my deputy, the fantastic Dean Hayden, who won't mind me talking about him. He's been a very public figure in counter-terrorism. When my phone went, my wife used to say, I hope that's not Dean.
Oh, really?
And that's not because we don't love Dean. It's because I didn't want Dean telling me how many people had just died.
I'm hearing all of this. I'm thinking, why on earth do you do it?
It's a really good question. I guess the thing is, you know, like everyone else, you are trained to do something. You know, you spend your entire life. I was a career detective, you know, from temporary detective constable to detective superintendent, and then I did lots of executive roles, head of armed policing, head of organised crime, and then moved into counter-terrorism for the last 6 years of my career. You are trained to investigate the most heinous of crimes to keep the public safe. And I always thought I joined policing to help the most vulnerable people in society at the worst point in their lives. That's why you do it. You don't really think about it whilst you're doing it. The dirty secret of policing is effectively when the public is at its most scared and at its lowest ebb, we're at our best. The adrenaline's going, this is what you're trained to do, this is what you want to do. You want to catch the bad guys and put them away. It's a bit like soldiers going to war. They probably think very differently when they come back, but when they're going, that's what we trained for. We're professionals, that's what we're meant to do. And it's a massive, as I said, it's a massive privilege. If you get it right and you save a life, I mean, there is no greater feeling that you could possibly have. You also wanted to talk about Palestine action and what's going on in the Middle East right now and whether or not that's affecting the terror level here in the UK and what we actually think of Palestine action and the Home Secretary considering prescribing that organisation. So we're going to be discussing that next.
The Crime Agents.
So, Neil, we've been talking a lot about terrorism in this episode and just looking at recent events, given what's happening in Iran and between the US. How does that play out? Because Sir Mark Rowley was saying that big geopolitical events like this, they always find themselves actually playing out on our streets.
Well, Sir Mark's absolutely correct. So you've only got to look back through history. Al-Qaeda, 9/11, the war on terror. If you look at what happened with the Iraq war and what that led to, so it starts off with mass protest, then goes to attacks. You look at 7/7, look at Lee Rigby, the Al-Qaeda-inspired domestic terror threat here at home. Look at 2014, ISIS, al-Baghdadi, al-Adnani, and their declaration of war on the West and what that led to, a massive spike in radicalisation, people travelling first to Syria and then attacking Western countries and the countries they'd come from. And then you look at Hamas and the horrific terrorist attack of the 7th of October 2023 and where we've got to there with mass protest, but also I strongly suspect, and I'm not briefed on this anymore, an uptick in people being radicalised and mobilising towards other terror threats.
And I think the tricky situation here is counter-terror police are telling me that one of their biggest concerns at the minute are threats from foreign states. And given how the UK are allies with the US, that'll be something that is going to be playing on their minds.
Yeah, it's funny, actually. I think Sir Mark and I ought to apologise to our successors for naming counter-terrorism policing because, of course, it's much wider than that. They do counterintelligence, they do war crimes, and they do Official Secrets Act investigations. So, yes, you're quite right. They're having to balance their resources against all of those priorities. And what's happened over the last 2 years, and I've heard Sir Mark talking about that this week, there has been a steady increase and flow of counter-state investigations such that it's a big proportion of their work now. That's got to make us nervous because my view is that hasn't led the counter-terrorism investigations to decrease. Yeah. So you're going to need more resource, more activity or more hard work to counter both those threats.
Do you think we're going to see a change in the terror threat level?
Difficult to say. There's a body called the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, JTAC.
Right.
JTAC are independent of government, but they're basically staffed by intelligence agents and some counter-terrorism police as well. They're the body that analyses all of the intelligence from all of the agencies and then basically advises what the threat level in the UK should be. And then we react to their judgment of the threat level. So if it does go up to severe, the public won't necessarily see an immediate change visibly to them, but we start to increase our protection levels around various iconic infrastructure institutions. We start warning people who need to be warned, and we start upping our surveillance on people who are subjects of interest. So do I think that's going to go up as a result of what's currently happening? I don't think so. This week we've seen, and we wait to see because it's changing hour by hour, a potential ceasefire in the Middle East. If that holds, then no, I don't see that happening. If it doesn't hold and we see more and more protests, then there is a possibility of JTAC in the future raising the threat level again.
And something else in the news this week is Palestine Action, the protest group. Now, the Home Secretary is saying that this group is going to be a prescribed, banned group. Now, I find this interesting because when you think of banned terror groups, you think of extreme Islamist groups, you think of far-right neo-Nazi groups. Is this group on that level? A lot of people will argue against it. And also this group will argue that there are already laws in place, such as criminal damage, to go after these. But I think the issue here is when you start infiltrating RAF bases, then you might be getting into a little bit of hot water when it comes to the security of the state.
Well, this is a really difficult issue, and I think they may have done their own legs with the Bryce Norton incursion.
I agree.
We all feel like we're on the edge of war, if not actually actively at war in our support to Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East with our most powerful ally. Then you invade a military base.
Yeah.
I mean, you are crossing a line there. There's no doubt about it, and any government has to react to that. But also any government's got to react to unlawful protest, and this group is quite clearly committed to criminal activity. It's a criminal protest group.
So we're Extinction Rebellion, though.
Yeah, absolutely, and they got arrested for it. So
Not
I think,
terrorism laws, though.
No, so I think the argument that why didn't you do Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil? Why weren't they environmental terrorists?
Yeah.
Section 1 of the Terrorism Act is what people need to read, 2000, because it describes what terrorist activity actually is. So if you're thinking serious damage to property, serious threats or violence to an individual, endangering the public, endangering a section of the public or intimidating a section of the public, have they reached that threshold? And the threshold for proscription has to be that they're a terrorist group. And that bar was always very high.
Yeah, I was just about to ask that. Are we in a situation now where the bar to become a prescribed terror group is lower than ever before?
Well, I don't know. It will depend on the vote next week and what the Home Secretary decides to do.
Should it be, though?
6 years in counter-terrorism and what I've seen, most of which has been utterly horrific, makes me think maybe the bar should be lower. We've talked about Al-Majroon and Anjem Choudhury. We haven't yet talked about, but in future episodes we'll be talking about extreme right-wing terrorism and National Action. Both ALM and National Action started off as groups that were operating under the radar and were not prescribed, and it took years to prescribe them.
Yeah, National Action, the very extreme far-right neo-Nazi group.
Yes. And both of them took years to be prescribed. The minute they were prescribed, it allowed counter-terrorism policing and the intelligence agencies to target them and to break them and to make sure that they were no longer a threat. But up until that point, they'd been a serious threat. So maybe the time is right to lower the bar, and we made mistakes in the past, and actually it would be better to cut off a potentially extremist group before they've developed their reach and they've developed their narrative and they've developed the people they want to radicalise.
Right, well, let's wrap this episode up, Neil. Just looking at my investigation revealing over 500 terrorists on our streets. And you were at the helm when these laws were being put in place and you were trying to catch them earlier. What's your final thought for this? Do you have any regret?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because at the time I thought we were doing a fantastic thing keeping the public safe by getting a lot of these people off the street. It's that old-fashioned policing adage of the turnstile with the more we arrest people, the shorter the sentence, they come out and they do it all again. You definitely don't want that with terrorists. So, yeah, I mean, there's real mixed feelings about how hard we work to put people away. But the reality is we ended up having to use a kind of Al Capone technique.
Yeah.
If we couldn't get you for terrorism, we'd get you for tax, which is why I call it that technique. But the reality was if we could not take the risk of you plotting, radicalising and actually committing a murderous attack. And if we couldn't prove your intent, but we could prove your preparations, then that led us to lesser offences, which is the reason why people are being released now. I'm not sure there is any way of getting away from that unless you want to take a massive risk with the public and try and let a surveillance operation go longer and longer and longer, hoping you're not going to lose track of the subject or have an intelligence failure and it lead to an attack. But what we do have to do, and you've highlighted it very much here, is make sure the system that I set up back in 2020, which was a system to try and improve the monitoring, including all agencies, probation, prison, police, intelligence agencies, the system we set up to monitor terrorists, potentially over their entire lifetime, if they couldn't be de-radicalised, has got to be well-resourced, well-funded and professionally done.
I wonder if you feel my investigation has in some way exposed faults in the systems that you had in place in terms of trying to get them quicker rather than a more extensive investigation?
I think it has, but I think those faults were exposed in the inquests into those inquiries we talked about.
Well, thanks for listening to the first episode of The Crime Agents. Remember to listen to the bonus episode, which is out now.
And make sure you subscribe on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts.
And you can find us on social media. We're at The Crime Agents, and that's on all social media platforms. And our email address is thecrimeagents@global.com. Please send in any questions you have, and we'll be answering them in a bonus episode next week.
And that's it, Andy. Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
The Crime Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.